The cold bit deeper than any tooth. Caleb Harper, 14 winters etched into his bones like the frost on the Nebraska sod, stepped into the razor-edged night. A sound had hooked him, not coyote, not wind. Something broken. Behind the barn, where moonlight bled onto trampled snow, he found her, a shadow with eyes. A girl, younger than spring but older than pain, curled against the weathered wood. Blood, black as tar in the weak light, stained her deer-hide dress. Her breath hitched, a dying bellows. Without thought, Caleb peeled a thick wool blanket from his own shoulders, the one Pa brought back from the war, and draped it over her shaking form. The prairie held its breath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I got something extra special saved just for you. Caleb's fingers trembled as he tucked the scratchy wool around the girl's shoulders. Her skin felt like ice under his knuckles. She didn't flinch, just stared up at him with eyes like pooled ink, reflecting the hard scatter of stars overhead. Frost clung to her lashes. Her lips were cracked, blue at the edges. "You're hurt," he whispered, the words puffing white in the air. She blinked slowly, her gaze drifting past him to the vast, indifferent dark. Her hand crept from beneath the blanket, fingers clutching a small pouch of worn leather, beaded with faded patterns that caught the starlight. A burst of sun, maybe, or a bird in flight. Her knuckles were scraped raw. A gust of wind hissed through the buffalo grass, carrying the smell of snow and distant loneliness. Caleb glanced back toward the farmhouse. A single window glowed yellow. Pa would be cleaning his Sharps rifle by the hearth. Ma, darning socks with tight, worried stitches. They couldn't know. Not yet. Pa's voice from supper echoed in Caleb's skull, rough as gravel. Saw tracks east of the creek today. Unshod ponies. Cheyenne, most like, restless since the soldiers pushed him off the Red Cloud Agency. The girl made a sound, a wet, shallow rattle deep in her chest. Caleb flinched. He couldn't leave her to freeze. "Gotta move you," he murmured, more to himself than her. He slid his arms beneath her, bracing for weight, but she was frighteningly light, bones sharp as flint under the deer hide. She stifled a cry against his coat as he lifted her, a sound like a wounded rabbit. Her breath warmed his neck, quick and fevered. The barn door groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of dry hay, old manure, and dust motes dancing in the slivers of moonlight piercing the roof slats. Caleb's boots crunched on frozen straw as he carried her to the farthest stall, where stacked bales formed a rough, hidden alcove. He laid her down gently on a bed of loose hay, pulling the blanket tight around her. Her eyes followed his every move, watchful, wary. "Water," he said. "I'll fetch some." Her hand shot out, surprisingly fast, and gripped his wrist. Her touch was freezing, her grip weak but insistent. She shook her head once, a sharp, tiny movement. Her other hand tightened around the beaded pouch. "Thirsty," Caleb insisted, gently pried her fingers loose. They felt brittle. "Be quick, quiet." He slipped out, easing the barn door shut behind him. The farmyard lay silver and still under moon. The Harper homestead felt like a raft adrift on a frozen sea. The sagging split-rail fence, the skeletal cottonwood by the well, the dark hump of the sod house. Smoke curled thin and gray from its chimney. Caleb crept to the rain barrel beside the lean-to kitchen, ice cracking under the tin dipper as he filled it. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Was that movement by the trilline? Just the wind worrying the bare branches of the box elders. Back inside the barn, the girl hadn't moved. He held the dipper to her lips. She drank in tiny, desperate sips, water spilling down her chin and onto the blanket. When she finished, she sank back, exhaustion etching deeper lines around her mouth. Her eyes drifted shut. Caleb crouched beside her, the hay prickling his knees. He studied her face in the gloom. High cheekbones, dark braids matted with mud, and something darker, blood maybe, a bruise bloomed purple along her jawline. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing a gash crusted with dried blood and dirt. Who did this? Soldiers? Other tribes? The cold itself? He remembered the pouch. "You got a name," he whispered. Her eyes flickered open. For a long moment, she just looked at him, as if weighing the cost of trust. Then, her voice a threadbare rasp, she spoke a single word. Nakoi. It meant nothing to Caleb. It hung in the cold air, a fragile, foreign thing. He repeated it clumsily. Nakeohe? A ghost of something, not a smile, but a softening, touched her lips. She nodded almost imperceptibly. Her hand moved weakly, patting the beaded pouch at her side. Footsteps crunched on the frozen ground outside the barn. Heavy, deliberate. Caleb froze, ice flooding his veins. Pa! The barn door rattled. Caleb? That you skulking in there? Thomas Harper's voice was a low rumble, thick with suspicion. Caleb's gaze locked with the girl's, Nakoi's. Her eyes widened, pure animal fear flashing in their depths. She shrank back into the hay, pulling the gray wool blanket over her head until only her dark, terrified eyes remained visible. Why, yes, Pa. Caleb called, his voice cracking. He scrambled up, kicking loose hay over the spot where Nakoi lay hidden. Just checking on the mare. Thought I heard her cuffing. He moved toward the door, blocking the view into the stall with his body. He yanked the door open just wide enough to slip out, then pulled it shut quickly behind him. His father stood framed in the moonlight, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the night. He held his rifle loosely, but his knuckles were white on the stock, his breath plumed in the cold. Thomas Harper's eyes, the color of flint, scanned Caleb's face, then darted past him to the barn door. Mare's fine, Caleb said too quickly. Probably just the wind. Pa didn't move. His gaze swept the yard, lingering on the dark line of the distant prairie. Wind don't make tracks, boy. He took a step closer. Caleb caught the smell of wood smoke and cheap tobacco clinging to his coat. Saw fresh ones this evening, heading straight toward the homestead, unshod, deep. His eyes narrowed, drilling into Caleb. You see anything? Hear anything out here tonight? Caleb's mouth went dry. He felt the weight of the barn behind him, the fragile life hidden within. He saw the stark fear in Nakoi's eyes. He thought of the gray blanket, Pa's blanket, now wrapped around a stranger Pa would likely call a threat. Lies felt like stones on his tongue. Nothing, Pa. Caleb managed, forcing his voice level. He met his father's stare, hoping the darkness had the tremor in his jaw. Just cold, real cold. Thomas Harper held his son's gaze for a long, silent moment. The wind moaned through the eaves of the barn. Somewhere far off, a lone crow cawed, a harsh, desolate sound. Pa's expression didn't soften. Doubt was a hard line between his brows. He gave a slow, deliberate sniff of the air, as if testing it. Cold brings wolves, he finally grunted. His eyes flicked once more to the barn door, then back to Caleb. And worse. Don't linger out here, boy. Bolt the barn good and get inside. Now! He turned, his boots crunching heavily back toward the warm glow of the house, a brooding shadow swallowed by the night. Caleb waited until Pa's footsteps faded. His heart thundered in his ears. He leaned his forehead against the ruffle of the barn door, the cold biting through his skin. Wolves. And worse. He needed to bolt the door. He needed to get inside. But he needed to see her one more time, to make sure the blanket covered her, to see if her eyes were still open, to ask what Nakoi meant. Gently, he pushed the door open just enough to slip back inside. The barn felt colder now, the silence heavier. He crept toward the stall, the straw whispering underfoot. It's just me, he whispered into the gloom. No movement, no sound. He rounded the stack of hay bales. The stall was empty. The gray blanket lay discarded in a heap on the scattered straw. The beaded pouch was gone. A wave of cold dread washed over him, colder than a Nebraska night. Where was she? How could she have moved? He scanned the shadows frantically. Had Pa seen? Had someone else taken her? A sound cut to the silence, not from inside the barn, but from outside, from a vast, open prairie beyond the fence line. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a crow. It was a high, lonely, carrying cry of a coyote. Then another answered it, closer. Then another, and another, rising and falling in a chilling chorus that prickled the hair on Caleb's neck. Except the rhythm was wrong. Too deliberate. Too close together. Too human. Caleb crept to the small, dirty window at the back of the barn, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He rubbed a patch clear on the grimy glass with his sleeve and peered out into the moon-washed expanse of snow stretching toward the black horizon. His breath caught in his throat, freezing solid. At the very edge of the moonlight, where the frozen grassland met the ink-black sky, stood a single, motionless figure on horseback, tall, silent, watching the Harper barn. And behind that first rider, just emerging from the gloom like ghosts coalescing from the night itself, were others, dozens of others, silhouettes against the stars, forming a long, unbroken line along the rise. The howling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deeper than any Caleb had ever known. It pressed against the barn walls, thick and suffocating. It was a silence of held breath, of drawn bows, of a decision poised on the edge of a knife. Outside the bolted barn door, the night waited. The frozen silence outside the barn window pressed against Caleb's eyes. The riders were motionless, stark silhouettes against the star-pricked blackness of the prairie horizon. Dozens, maybe more, lost in the moon-washed gloom beyond the rise. No sound reached him now, not even the wind. It was the quiet of a coiled spring, of breath held too long. His own breath fogged the grimy pain as he stared, heart hammering a frantic tattoo against his ribs. Nakoi, where was she? He tore himself from the window, stumbling back into the barn's deeper shadows. The empty stall mocked him. The discarded blanket lay like a gray accusation on the straw. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. Had they taken her already? Had she fled toward them or away? He scanned the gloom desperately. Behind the anvil, under the broken wagon tongue, within the hollow stack of oat sacks. Nothing but dust motes dancing in the weak moonlight. A faint scrape, like stone on stone. It came from the corner farthest from the door, behind the ancient, rusted harrow discs piled against the wall. Caleb crept forward, his boots whispering on the straw. Peering into the narrow gap between the discs and the rough-hewn logs, he saw movement. A sliver of deer hide, a pale hand, curled protectively around the beaded pouch. She'd wedged herself into the impossibly small space, a shadow among shadows, her wounded shoulder pressed against the cold iron. Her eyes, wide and dark, locked onto his. Not relief, not fear, just waiting, assessing. They're out there, Caleb breathed, the words barely audible. He gestured vaguely toward the window. Horses, riders, watching. Nako, he didn't turn her head. Her gaze remained fixed on him. Slowly, deliberately, she raised one finger to her cracked lips. Silence. Then, with agonizing slowness, she extended her hand, palm up, towards a discarded blanket. A plea, or an order. Caleb snatched it up, the wool rough in his grip. He pushed it through the gap. He saw her fumbling fingers grasp it, pulling it over herself like a shield, shrinking further into the iron embrace of the harrow. Only the faintest gleam of her eyes remained visible above the gray wool. Pa's blanket. Hiding a girl Pa would call a threat. The lie curdled in Caleb's stomach. He retreated to the window. The riders hadn't moved. They were a dark freeze against the night, silent sentinels. Why? Were they waiting for a signal? For dawn? For him to leave? The weight of their unseen eyes was a physical pressure on the back of his neck. He couldn't bolt the barn door now. Not with her trapped inside. Not with them watching. Minutes bled into an hour, measured by the slow crawl of the moon across the high barn window. Caleb alternated between watching the unnerving stillness on the prairie and glancing back at the dark crevice where Nakohi hid. Her silence was absolute. He fetched the tin dipper again, filled it silently from the rain barrel ice hole, and slid it through the gap. A pale hand emerged, took it, retreated. He heard the small, desperate sounds of her drinking. Later, he risked tearing a strip from an old feed sack. He dipped it in the icy water, hesitated, then added a splash from the small, harsh bottle of whiskey Pa, kept for cleaning wounds, tucked behind the harness pegs. He passed the damp cloth through the gap. "For the cut," he whispered. A long pause, then the cloth was taken. He heard a sharp, stifled intake of breath, quickly smothered. He imagined her pressing the stinging whiskey to her shoulder, jaw clenched against the pain. A wave of fierce protectiveness washed over him, surprising in its intensity. He leaned his forehead against the cold wood of the harrow frame. Nakohi murmured, testing the name. "What does it mean?" Silence from the shadows. Then, so faint he almost missed it. Bear, strong, fierce, hiding wounded in the dark. It fit and it didn't. He remembered the pouch. What's in the bag? No answer. Only the sound of her uneven breathing. Dawn was a reluctant gray smear in the east when the riders moved. Not forward, not toward the homestead. As one, silently, they turned their horses. One by one, they melted back over the rise, dissolving into the pre-dawn gloom like smoke on the wind. Within moments, the horizon was empty. The vast, frozen prairie showed no sign it had ever been there. Only the memory of their silent vigil remained, cold and heavy in Caleb's bones. He slumped against the wall, exhaustion hitting him like a blow. The immediate danger had receded, but the fear had burrowed deeper. They knew she was here. He waited until the farmhouse door creaked open, and he heard Pa's heavy tread heading towards a woodpile. Only then did he whisper to the crevice, "They're gone, for now." Nakohi didn't emerge immediately. When she finally did, crawling stiffly out from behind the discs, she looked worse. The fever had deepened. A hectic flush burned high on her cheeks against the unnatural pallor of her skin. Her eyes were glassy, the wound on her shoulder angry and swollen beneath the rough dressing. She clutched the blanket around her like a lifeline, the beaded pouch a hard lump against her side. She swayed on her feet. Caleb caught her arm before she fell. Her skin burned through the deer hide. "You need proper medicine," he said helplessly. "Food." She shook her head weakly, pulling her arm free. Her gaze darted toward the barn door, then back to him. "Go," she rasped, the word thick with pain and fever. "Your father." He couldn't leave her like this. Not now. He thought of Ma's meager medicine chest. Willow bark tea, maybe a biscuit. "I'll come back," he promised, "with food. When I can." Her eyes held his for a long moment. Doubt warred with a desperate need. Finally, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Trust, frail as a spiderweb. She sank back into the straw, pulling the blanket over her head, retreating into her hidden world of pain and fear. Caleb slipped out of the barn, bolting the door with hands that shook only slightly. The morning air was knife-sharp, smelling of snow and wood smoke. Pa was splitting logs near the pile, his breath pluming white. He paused, axe resting on the chopping block, as Caleb approached. His flinty eyes scanned the boy's face, then the barn door. Mare settled. Pa grunted. "Seems so, Pa," Caleb lied, forcing his voice level. He kept walking toward the sod house, avoiding his father's gaze. "Just the wind last night, I reckon." He felt Pa's stare on his back, heavy and suspicious, all the way to the door. The day passed in a blur of tension. Caleb chopped wood, hauled water, mended a section of fence under Pa's watchful eye, his mind screaming Nakohi. Every sound, the call of a crow, the distant low of Ritter's cattle, made him jump. He stole glances towards a barn, a silent fortress holding his secret. He managed to slip a biscuit and a small piece of salt pork into his pocket during the hurried midday meal. Eating little himself, his stomach knotted. Ma watched him, her brow furrowed. "You're quiet, Caleb, and you barely touched your stew. Feeling poorly?" "Just cold, Ma," he muttered, staring into his tin bowl. "Tired from last night. Heard noises." Pa's spoon clattered against his bowl. "Wolves, like I said." His voice was flat. "Or worse. Old man Ritter rode by earlier. Said he saw a band of Cheyenne moving fast, northeast of here. Maybe 20 braves. Restless. Hungry." His eyes flicked to Caleb. "Told him we saw tracks too. Day before." He pushed his chair back. "Keep your eyes sharp, boy. And your ears." Caleb felt the biscuit in his pocket, like a hot coal. 20 braves. But he'd seen dozens on the rise. Were there more? Were they circling, waiting for nightfall? He waited until late afternoon, when Pa rode out to check the far pasture fence line, and Ma was absorbed in churning butter. He slipped into the barn, heart in his throat. Nako he was curled where he'd left her, shivering violently under the blanket despite the fever burning through her. She didn't stir when he approached. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. He knelt, placing the biscuit and pork near her hand. "Nako," her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. She stared past him, murmuring something in a language he didn't understand, the words slurred and feverish. She clutched the beaded pouch tighter to her chest. Then her gaze seemed to find him. Recognition flickered, followed by a dazed terror. "Viho," she whispered, the word harsh and guttural. "White men. Many. Coming." Caleb froze. "Soldiers? Coming here?" She didn't answer. Her eyes rolled back, her body convulsing in a sudden, racking cough that left her gasping. A thin trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth. She slumped back, unconscious, the pouch still gripped tight in her fist. "Viho. Many. Coming." The words echoed in the cold barn air. Were they chasing her? Were they coming for him? Caleb touched her forehead. Burning. She needed help he couldn't give. He pulled the blanket tighter around her trembling form, a useless gesture against the enemy within. He heard the distant crunch of hooves on frozen earth. Pa returning. Caleb scrambled up, kicking straw over the meager food offering. He had to get out. Now, he slipped from the barn just as his father rode into the yard. Thomas Harper dismounted, his movement stiff with cold and something else, a new alertness. He didn't look at Caleb. Instead, he walked straight to the barn door, his hand resting on the heavy latch. "Thought I saw something," Pa said, his voice dangerously calm. "By the creek, bed earlier. Looked like dragging through the snow towards a barn." His flinty eyes finally met Caleb's, sharp and unreadable. "You sure you ain't seen nothing, boy?" "Nothing at all." He pulled the barn door open. The dim interior yawned before them. Caleb's blood turned to ice. He saw the kicked straw, the disturbed pile near the harrow discs. He saw the edge of the gray wool blanket peeking out from Nakoi's hiding place. Pa stepped inside, his silhouette dark against the doorway. He took 2 slow steps into the gloom, his gaze sweeping the barn floor, the stalls, the shadows. It landed on the kicked straw, then on the scrap of gray wool. He stopped. His hand slowly moved toward the rifle slung across his back. "Caleb," Pa said, his voice low and tight as a bowstring. "What in God's name is my blanket doing back here?" Time stopped. Thomas Harper's hand rested on his rifle stock, knuckles white. His eyes, chips of flint in the barn's gloom, locked onto the scrap of gray wool peeking from behind the harrow discs. The kicked straw around it screamed guilt. Caleb's throat closed. Every lie he'd told solidified into a stone blocking his breath. "That blanket," Pa said, the words low and deliberate, "was folded on my trunk this morning." He took another step deeper into the barn, his boots crunching on the frozen dirt floor. His gaze swept the shadows near the discs, then pinned Caleb. "Explain." Caleb's mind raced. A panic horse in a burning barn. Sick animal. Lost dog. Anything. But Pa knew animals. Knew the land. Knew lies. The truth clawed at Caleb's insides. The feverish girl. The silent riders. The pouch clutched tight. He opened his mouth, a denial forming, when a sound cut the thick air. A low, pained whimper. From behind the discs, Pa's had snapped toward the noise. His hand tightened on the rifle. What in hell? Raccoon! Caleb blurted, the word too loud. He stepped sideways, deliberately placing himself between Pa and the hiding spot. Trap one. Mean bastard. Bit me? He thrust out his hand, showing the red, raw scrape on his knuckles from hauling firewood that morning. Must have dragged the blanket back there for a nest? I was trying to flush it out when you came in. His voice shook. He couldn't stop it. Pa stared at the scrape, then back at the shadowed discs. Doubt wore with ingrained suspicion. The whimper came again, weaker this time, muffled by wool. It sounded more animal than human in the echoing space. Caleb held his breath, tasting dust and dread. Raccoon, Pa repeated flatly. He didn't lower his hand from the rifle. His eyes narrowed, probing Caleb's face. Drag my war blanket? He took another step closer to the discs. Caleb felt sweat prickle his spine, despite the cold. Pa leaned forward slightly, peering into the dark crevice. Caleb braced for the shout. The shot. From the sod house, Ma's voice cut through the tension, sharp with alarm. Thomas. Smoke. North Ridge. Pa straightened instantly, his hunter's instinct overriding suspicion. He spun toward the barn door, his focus shifting to the immediate threat. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. Unwelcome people. He gave Caleb one last, hard look. Deal with that vermin. Now. Then bolt this door and get inside. And Caleb, his voice dropped, colder than the Nebraska wind. That blanket better be on my trunk by sundown. Clean. He strode out, slamming the barn door behind him. Caleb sagged against the ruff of the stall, trembling. He heard Pa's heavy tread running toward the house, shouting for Ma. Silence rushed back into the barn, heavier than before. Caleb waited, counting his frantic heartbeats. When no sound came from the harrowed discs, fear twisted in his gut. Had she stopped breathing? He scrambled over. Nako he lay curled, the blanket pulled over her head. She was shivering violently, her breath coming in shallow, wet gas that rattled in her chest. A fresh smear of blood darkened the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were closed, her face slick with fever sweat. The beaded pouch was pressed against her cheek like a talisman. She didn't stir when he touched her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin was terrifying. Nakohi, he whispered, desperation cracking his voice. Can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered. A low moan escaped her lips. Her hand, trembling, moved weakly toward the pouch, her fingers brushing the faded, beaded pattern. The burst of sun, the bird. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Caleb knew he needed more than water now. He needed Ma's willow bark tea, the only thing they had against fever. He needed broth. He needed help he couldn't ask for. He covered her carefully with the blanket again, tucking the edges tight, a useless barrier against the fire consuming her from within. Hold on, he murmured, the plea as much for himself as for her. Just hold on. He slipped out, bolting the doors ordered. The yard was empty. Pa was likely on the roof, scanning the North Ridge with a spyglass. Caleb ducked into the sod house. The air inside was thick with the smell of stew and simmering tension. Ma stood by the small window, wringing her hands, her face pale. What is it, Ma? Smoke, Caleb asked, trying to sound normal, moving toward the cupboard where Ma kept her meager remedies. Column of it, Ma said, her voice tight. Northwest, moving slow, too much for a campfire. She turned, her worried eyes scanning him. You're white as milk, Caleb, and shaken. Did that creature bite you bad? No, Ma, Caleb mumbled, grabbing the small cloth pouch of dried willow bark and a tin cup. Just cold, scared about the smoke. Thought I'd make some willow tea. Settle my nerves. It was a thin excuse, but Ma's focus was on the unseen threat outside. Good idea, she murmured distractedly, turning back to the window. Your pa thinks it might be soldiers, cavalry patrol, or others. She didn't say Cheyenne, but the word hung unspoken. Caleb's stomach clenched. Viho, many, coming. Nakohi's feverish warning echoed. He snatched a heel of hard bread and a small chunk of salt pork from the pantry shelf. Stuffing them into his coat pocket, he poured boiling water from the kettle onto the willow bark in the cup, the bitter scent rising. Gonna drink this in the barn, Ma. Check on the mare again. Make sure she's settled with all this ruckus. Ma nodded absently. Be quick and stay low. Back in the barn's frigid gloom, Caleb found Nakohi conscious, her eyes half open, glazed with fever. She watched him approach, a flicker of awareness in the depths. He knelt, holding the steaming cup. Tea. For the fever. He lifted her head gently, supporting it with his hand. Her hair was damp with sweat against his palm. He held the cup to her lips. She sipped, grimacing at the bitterness, but drank until it was half gone. The effort exhausted her. She sank back, panting. Caleb pulled the bread and pork from his pocket. Eat, please. She looked at the food, then at him. A tremor ran through her. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her hand, not toward the food, but towards a beaded pouch resting on her chest. Her fingers traced the sunburst pattern. Esahi, she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. Morning star. Her gaze shifted to Caleb's face, searching. My mother. The words cost her. Tears welled in her fever-bright eyes but didn't fall. She closed her hand over the pouch, holding it tight, as if drawing strength from a memory stitched into leather. Caleb understood. The pouch wasn't just an object. It was a tether, like Pa's blanket was a tether to a past Caleb only knew through grim stories. He touched the scratchy wool covering her. This belonged to my Pa, from the war, between the states. He didn't know why he told her. Maybe because she'd share a fragment of her own shattered world. He wouldn't understand. Nakohi's eyes held his. There was no judgment, only a profound weariness, a shared understanding of loss. Her hand moved weakly, resting briefly on top of his where it lay on the blanket. Her skin was furnace hot, but the touch was deliberate, a silent acknowledgement, gratitude, trust. It lasted only a second before her hand fell away, limp. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the barn walls. It carried a new sound now, not coyotes, not crows. A rhythmic, distant thudding, faint but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, many of them, getting closer. Caleb's blood ran cold. He scrambled to the small, dirty window. Peering out, he saw Pa standing by the woodpile, spyglass raised, rigid as a stone sentinel, facing northwest. Ma was in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight. Beyond the split-rail fence, rising over the frozen swell of the near prairie, a line of mounted figures crested the ridge, not silent silhouettes against the stars like the night riders. These men rode under the leaden afternoon sky. They wore dark blue coats. Sunlight glinted off metal buttons and rifle barrels. Soldiers, cavalry, a small detachment, perhaps 20 riders, moving at a steady trot directly towards a Harper homestead, dust plumed from their horses' hooves, a dirty smudge against the pale winter landscape. At their head rode an officer, his posture stiff and purposeful. Nakohi made a choke sound behind him. Caleb turned. She had pushed herself up on one elbow, her face a mask of pure terror, her eyes fixed on a window, seeing what he saw. Viho! She gasped, the word thick with dread. She clutched the SAE pouch like a shield against her heart. Her breath hitched, then dissolved into a violent fit of coughing that racked her thin frame. She doubled over, retching, a dark stain spreading on the straw beneath her. Caleb rushed to her side. Blood, fresh and bright, flecked her lips and chin. Her eyes rolled back. Her body went rigid for a terrifying second, then slumped, boneless, onto the blanket. Her chest barely rose. The pouch slipped from her grasp, falling onto the blood-speckled straw. "Nakoi," Caleb whispered, shaking her shoulder gently. "Bear, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, seeing something far beyond the barn's rough walls. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Then her gaze locked onto Caleb's face with sudden, startling clarity. Fear was still there, but beneath it a desperate urgency. She lifted a trembling hand, pointing weakly, not toward the soldiers outside, but toward the pouch lying in the straw. Her voice was a ghost of sound, barely audible over the approaching drumbeat of hooves. "Hiva-e," she breathed. The word hung in the cold air, fragile and final. Her hand dropped. Her eyes closed. Her chest stilled, then gave one shallow, shuddering rise. A thread of crimson trickled from the corner of her mouth onto the gray wool of Pa's war blanket. Outside, the hoofbeat stopped. A voice, sharp and commanding, rang out across the frozen yard. "Thomas Harper, this is Lieutenant Ames, 5th Cavalry. We require a word." Lieutenant Ames' voice hung in the frozen air like gun smoke. Caleb's world narrowed to the shallow rise and fall of Nakoi's chest beneath the gray blanket, the bright thread of blood tracing her jawline. "Hiri," the word echoed, meaningless yet heavy with finality. Outside, boot heels crunched on frozen earth. Pa's answering call was low and wary. "Lieutenant, state your business." Caleb moved before thought. He snatched the SAE pouch from the blood-speckled straw, its beads cold against his palm. With frantic hands, he piled loose hay over Nakoi's still form, burying her beneath the scratchy gold, leaving only the faintest depression and the edge of the blanket visible. He kicked more straw over the bloodstain, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The pouch! He shoved it deep into his coat pocket, the beaded sunburst pressing against his thigh. He scrambled his feet just as the barn door groaned open. Thomas Harper stood silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, Lieutenant Ames a rigid, blue-clad figure behind him. The officer was young, clean-shaven, his face sharp and impatient beneath the brim of his forage cap. His eyes, pale and assessing, swept the barn's dim interior. The stalls, the stacked bales, the rusted harrow discs, finally landing on Caleb. "Your boy, Mr. Harper?" Ames asked, his voice clipped. "My son, Caleb," Pa replied, his own gaze locked on Caleb, sharp as a flint edge. Suspicion radiated from him, colder than the Nebraska wind whistling through the cracks. Ames stepped inside, his spurs jingling faintly. 2 troopers hovered behind him in the doorway, rifles held loosely but ready. The barn suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. The smell of dust, hay, and horse was overlaid by the scent of wet wool, leather, and gun oil. "We're tracking a Cheyenne raiding party," Ames stated, his eyes still scanning the shadows. "Ambushed a supply train 3 days north. Took horses, ammunition. Killed 2 teamsters." His gaze snapped back to Caleb. "Reports say a young woman was wounded during the fight, separated from the main group. We believe she might be seeking shelter or dying nearby." He paused, letting the implication hang. "You seen anything? Anyone?" Caleb's mouth was desert dry. He felt the weight of the pouch in his pocket, the hidden girl beneath the hay. He saw Pa's eyes flicker toward the disturbed straw near the discs, toward the barely visible gray wool edge. Lies crowded his throat, thick and choking. No, never. Just a sick raccoon. But the image of Nakoi's terrified face as she gasped Viho burned behind his eyes. "Boy." Pa's voice was a low rumble, a warning. "No, sir," Caleb managed, forcing his gaze to meet the lieutenant's pale eyes. He prayed his voice didn't shake. Just the animals here, and the cold. Heard coyotes last night. That's all." Ames' expression didn't change. He took another step deeper into the barn, his polished boots sinking into the straw. He stopped near the harrow discs, his eyes lingering on the kicked-up hay, the unnatural mound Caleb had created. "Cold drives creatures to shelter," he remarked, his tone deceptively casual. He nudged a wisp of straw with his toe, sometimes dangerous ones. One of the troopers shifted, peering into the stall where the mare stood placidly chewing. Caleb held his breath. He could see the faint outline of Nakoi's shoulder beneath the thin layer of hay. One cough, one moan. "Thomas." Ma's voice called from the yard, laced with anxiety. "Supper's the lieutenant and his men. Are they needing anything?" Ames glanced towards the door, a flicker of impatience crossing his face. "We're searching the outbuildings, ma'am. Standard procedure. Won't take long." He looked back at Thomas. "Mind if my men check your barn thoroughly, Mr. Harper? For the safety of your family." Pa's jaw tightened. He hated soldiers almost as much as he distrusted Cheyenne. Reminders of a war that had taken his brother and left him with ghosts and a Sharps rifle. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Do what you gotta do, Lieutenant, but be quick about it." The two troopers stepped fully inside, their movements methodical. One began poking at hay bales with his rifle, but the other moved toward the back stalls, his eyes sharp. Caleb felt sweat prickle his temples despite the chill. He inched sideways, subtly placing himself closer to the hidden mound near the discs. He could see the slight, shallow rise of the blanket where Nako he breathed. "Don't cough. Please don't cough." The trooper near the back knocked over an empty bucket. The clatter made Caleb jump. The soldier chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He turned, his eyes sweeping past Caleb, past the harrowed discs, and stopped. He crouched, peering at the frozen dirt floor near the barn wall. He picked something up, a small bent feather dyed a faded red. "Cheyenne work, Lieutenant," the trooper said, holding it up. "Looks fresh." Ames strode over, taking the feather. His pale eyes turned icy, locking onto Caleb. "You sure you saw nothing, boy? Heard nothing? Found nothing like this?" Caleb's mind raced. The pouch. The feather must have come from it. Found a dead crow yesterday," he stammered, the lie tasting like ash. "Out by the fence. Had feathers missing. Maybe that's one." Pa's stare was a physical weight. Suspicion hardened into something darker. He knew Caleb was lying. He knew it deep in his bones. Ames studied the feather, then Caleb's face. Doubt warred with duty. He opened his mouth, likely to order a more invasive search, when a commotion erupted outside. Shouted orders. The nervous whinny of cavalry horses. A trooper burst into the barn doorway, breathless. "Lieutenant, riders, East Ridge, a whole damn bunch of 'em." Ames was out the door in an instant, the feather forgotten in his fist. Pa followed, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned near the entrance. Caleb rushed to the small window, rubbing a clear patch on the grimy glass. On the eastern rise, stark against the leaden sky, stood the silent riders. Dozens, more than before. They weren't melting away this time. They sat motionless on their ponies, a long, dark line stretching along the ridge like teeth on a saw blade. No war cries, no movement, just watching, waiting. The air itself seemed to crackle with their silent intent. Lieutenant Ames barked orders. Troopers scrambled onto their mounts, rifles unslung. The neat formation dissolved into focused urgency. Ames mounted his own horse, his face grim. He turned to Thomas Harper, still standing rigidly by the barn door. "That's them, Harper, the raiding party, or part of it." His gaze swept the homestead, lingering for a fraction on the barn, then back to the ridge. "Stay inside. Bolt your doors. If that wounded girl is here, she's likely the reason they've come." He wheeled his horse. "Troop, forward, walk, march." The column lurched into motion, heading toward the silent watchers on the ridge at a cautious trot, kicking up puffs of frozen dust. Pa watched them go, his knuckles white on his rifle stock. The fear Caleb had always sensed beneath his father's sternness was naked now, etched in the lines around his eyes. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the yard, the house where Ma stood pale in the doorway, and finally landing on Caleb, still framed in the barn window. Without a word, Thomas Harper walked back toward the barn, not to the door Caleb stood in. He walked around the side, towards the back corner, where the weather would met the frozen ground, toward the spot where Caleb had first found Nako curled against the wall, blood staining the snow. Caleb's breath caught. He remembered the blood. He'd kicked snow over it, but not enough. Not for Pa's sharp eyes. He heard his father stop, heard the crunch of snow under boot leather, heard the low, guttural curse that carried on the wind. Caleb turned from the window. The barn was silent again, except for the mare's soft munching and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He knelt beside the mound of hay near the harrowed discs. Gently, he brushed the straw away from Nako's face. Her skin was still fever-hot, her breathing a thin, ragged whisper. A fresh trickle of blood had seeped from her lips onto the gray wool, but her eyes were open, barely, focused on him with a terrifying intensity. "Hiva-e," she breathed again, the word barely audible. Her trembling hand emerged from the straw, not pointing this time, but reaching weakly for Caleb's coat pocket, for the pouch. "Nakwi'ivhain." The words dissolved into a wet cough. Caleb understood the gesture, the desperate need. He pulled the Essahi pouch from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. Her fingers closed around it like a drowning woman clutching a rope. She held it against her heart, her eyes closing, a single tear tracking through the grime on her cheek. Footsteps sounded outside the barn door. Heavy, deliberate, Pa's footsteps. The latch rattled. The barn door began to creak open. Nako's eyes flew open, wide with a fresh wave of fear. She tried to shrink deeper into the straw, pulling the blanket over her face, but her movements were feeble, exposed. Caleb stood up, placing himself squarely between the opening door and the hidden girl. His hands were empty, clenched into fists at his sides. He faced a widening slice of gray light, his heart a drumbeat against his ribs. Thomas Harper stepped inside. His face was stone. Snow dusted his shoulders. He didn't look at Caleb. His flinty eyes went straight to the disturbed hay near the discs, to the edge of the gray blanket, to the shape beneath it that was unmistakably human. Then his gaze dropped to the floor near his boots, to the patch of trampled snow and dirt where Caleb had found Nako, where dark stains, old and new, marred the frozen earth. Blood. Pa slowly raised his eyes to meet Caleb's. The rifle hung loosely in his grip, but his finger rested near the trigger guard. The silence in the barn was absolute, broken only by Nako's shallow, rasping breath. "Caleb," Pa said, his voice dangerously quiet, colder than the deepest winter night. "Who's under my blanket?" The barn air crystallized. Thomas Harper's knuckles were bone-white on the rifle stock. His gaze, flint on flint, held Caleb's, a wordless demand that vibrated in the frozen silence. Behind Caleb, under the gray wool of Pa's war blanket, Nako's shallow breath hitched, a fragile counterpoint to the hammering of Caleb's heart. Caleb didn't step aside. He planted his boots in the straw-dusted dirt, a 14-year-old wall between his father and the wounded girl. The pouch in his pocket felt like a stone, heavy with Nako's whispered word. He met Pa's stare, the fear of cold river in his veins, but beneath it, something harder formed. A resolve forged in the quiet hours of tending, in the terror of the riders, in the weight of the pouch. "Her name is Nako," Caleb said, his voice rough but steady. It sounded too loud in the stillness. "Bear. She's hurt. Dying, maybe. I found her out back. Blood in the snow. Couldn't leave her." Pa's expression didn't flicker. His eyes darted past Caleb to the bundled shape, the faint stain of crimson on the blanket's edge. "Cheyenne." The word was a bullet. "Yes," Caleb breathed. He saw the muscles tense in Pa's forearm, the subtle shift of his finger near the trigger. She's not raiding anyone, Pa. She's just lost, hurt, scared. He took a half step forward, blocking the view completely. Like that rabbit with the broken leg last spring. Remember? Ma helped you splint it. A flicker, deep in Pa's flinty eyes. A memory surfacing, not of war, but of shared mercy on a smaller scale. His jaw worked. Rabbits don't bring warriors, boy. Before Caleb could answer, Ma appeared in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the fading gray light. Her eyes widened, taking in the tableau. Pa rigid with a rifle, Caleb standing defiant, the unmistakable human form beneath the blanket behind him. Her hand flew to her mouth. Then, without a word, she pushed past Thomas, her worn skirts brushing against the rifle barrel. She knelt beside the hay pile, her movement swift and sure. Gently, she pulled the blanket back from Nakoi's face. The girl's fever-bright eyes blinked open, unfocused at first, then locking onto Ma's face, a woman's face, not a soldier's. A low whimper escaped her cracked lips. Ma's expression softened, etched with immediate, instinctive pity. She touched Nakoi's forehead, her lips tightening at the heat. She saw the blood, the pallor, the desperate clutch on the beaded pouch. Thomas Harper, Ma said, her voice low but carrying the weight of years of shared hardship, of quiet authority. Put that rifle down. Now. She didn't look at him. Her hands were already moving, tucking the blanket tighter, brushing sweat-matted hair from Nakoi's brow. This child needs a healer, not a bullet. Caleb, fetch my medicine chest and the broth from the hearth. Hurry. Pa didn't move. The rifle remained. His gaze was fixed on Ma's bent back, on the fragile life she sheltered. The conflict wore on his face, ingrained suspicion, the old fear of blue coats and war cries, warring against the undeniable sight of suffering, against a quiet command in his wife's voice, against a memory of the splintered rabbit. Caleb didn't wait. He darted past Pa, out into the biting cold, relief warring with terror. He ran to the sod house, grabbed the small wooden chest and the covered pot of lukewarm broth, his hands shaking. When he returned, Pa was still standing, but the rifle's muzzle now pointed at the dirt floor. His shoulders were slumped, the fight momentarily drained, replaced by a weary confusion. Ma worked with efficient grace. She cleaned Nakoi's wound with water and the last dregs of whiskey, her touch gentle despite the girl's flinches. She forced sips of broth between cracked lips, murmuring soft, meaningless reassurances. Caleb held Nakoi's head, feeling the terrifying heat, watching the flicker of awareness return briefly to her eyes as she swallowed. Her gaze found Caleb, then darted fearfully to Pa, still a looming shadow. "Hiva-e," she whispered again, her voice a threadbare rasp. Her trembling hand patted the beaded pouch on her chest. "Nisun, my brother." The word landed in the stillness. Hiva-e wasn't a warning. It was a plea, a name. Outside, a new sound arose. Not the jingle of cavalry tack, but a low, rhythmic drumming, distant at first, then growing closer, vibrating through the frozen ground. A single, high-pitched cry, like an eagle's call, echoed across the prairie. Then another, and another. Pa stiffened, the rifle coming up instinctively. He strode to the small window, rubbing a clear patch. Caleb followed, peering out. The eastern ridge was no longer lined with silent watchers. They were moving, not charging, walking, slowly, deliberately, down the slope towards a Harper homestead. Dozens of mounted figures, ponies stepping carefully on the frozen earth, their riders wrapped in blankets against the cold. No rifles were raised. No war cries sounded. Just that steady drumming, like a heartbeat, an occasional piercing cry. At their head rode a single figure, taller than the others, his bearing erect, a single eagle feather stark against the gray sky. "They're coming," Pa breathed, his voice tight. He glanced back at Nakoi, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Hiri, brother, leader." Ma stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked from Nakohi to the approaching riders, then to Thomas. Her face was pale but resolute. "You go out, Thomas. Caleb, you stay with her." She moved to stand beside Pa, her presence a silent anchor. "Take the rifle, but hold it low." Pa hesitated, his gaze lingering on the girl on the barn floor, on the pouch clutched to her heart, on Ma's determined face. With a grunt that seemed to release the last of his coiled tension, he uncocked the sharps, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out into the fading afternoon. Ma followed, a step behind. Caleb knelt beside Nakohi. Her eyes were wide open now, fixed on the barn door. Fear still shadowed them, but beneath it, a desperate, fragile hope. "Hivi'i," she whispered again, a prayer. The drumming stopped abruptly just outside the barn. Silence fell deeper than before. Caleb could hear the wind sighing through the grass, the ragged rasp of Nakohi's breath, the thud of his own heart. He heard Pa's voice, low and steady, though the words were muffled. Then another voice, deeper, resonant, speaking in a language Caleb didn't know, but the tone was clear, not hostile, but heavy with inquiry, perhaps grief. Minutes stretched, taut as a bowstring. Caleb held Nakohi's burning hand. She squeezed back weakly. Her eyes never left the door. It opened. Not Pa, not Ma. A man stood framed in the doorway, ducking slightly to enter. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered but sharp, eyes dark and intense as Nakohi's. He wore a buckskin shirt adorned with quill work, and a single eagle feather was tied into his long, braided hair. His gaze swept the barn, dismissing Caleb instantly, locking onto the figure on the floor. A low sound escaped him, not a word, but a visceral exhalation of pain and relief. He crossed the space in 3 strides and knelt beside his sister. He touched her face, his large hand surprisingly gentle. He spoke her name, Nakohi, the word soft, imbued with a depth of feeling that needed no translation. He saw the wound, the fever flush, the blood on the blanket. His jaw tightened, a flicker of rage quickly banked into grim concern. Nakohi reached up, her hand trembling, touching the eagle feather. "Hivi'i," she breathed, a tear finally escaping. She clutched the Esahi pouch, pressing against her brother's chest, murmuring rapidly in Cheyenne, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Hivi'i listened, his dark eyes taking the gray blanket, covering her, the clean cloth dressing the wound, the tin cup nearby. His gaze lifted, finally settling on Caleb. There was no smile, but the fierce intensity softened, replaced by a profound, wordless acknowledgement. He gave a single, slow nod. Gratitude. Respect. He spoke a few sharp words. 2 other warriors entered the barn, carrying a simple travois made of poles and hide. With infinite care, they lifted Nakohi, blanket and all, onto it. She winced but didn't cry out, her eyes clinging to Caleb as they lifted her. Her hand moved weakly, pointing toward the corner where Pa's war blanket lay crumpled, now stained with her blood and dirt. "Take it," Caleb whispered, understanding. "Keep her warm." Hivi'i looked at the blanket, then at Caleb. He shook his head once. He pointed to the blanket on Nakohi, then to Caleb, then to his own heart. "It is yours." The debt is felt. He reached to his belt and drew out a small knife in a beaded sheath. He held out to Caleb, not as a weapon, but as an offering, a token. Caleb hesitated, then took it. The beads were faded blues and reds, the leather worn smooth. Hivi'i nodded again, then turned and followed the travois bearers out into the dusk. Caleb stood in the doorway, the beaded knife cold in his hand. Pa and Ma stood side by side near the barn, watching silently. The line of riders was already receding, moving back up the eastern ridge at the same deliberate walk, the travois a small shape in their midst. The drumming began again, low and steady, a heartbeat fading into the distance. No eagle cries now, just the wind and the settling cold. Pa turned. His face was unreadable in the twilight, etched with exhaustion and something new, a deep, unsettled thoughtfulness. He looked at the blood-stained patch of earth near the barn wall, then at Caleb, then at the knife in his son's hand. He didn't speak. He just walked toward the house, his steps heavy. Ma came to Caleb's side. She touched his arm, her fingers cold. She looked toward the empty ridge, then at the knife. "Bear gave you a gift," she said softly. Her eyes held a quiet wonder, a fragile hope amidst a lingering fear. "And you gave her back her life, Caleb Harper." They stood together as the last light bled from the sky. The prairie stretched vast and silent, the riders gone like ghosts. But the line they had formed, that silent vigil of watching warriors, remained etched in Caleb's mind. It wasn't a threat. It had been a question, a demand for the return of what was theirs. And they had left without fire, without steel, leaving only the echo of drums and a weight of a debt acknowledged in a beaded knife. Inside the barn, Pa's blood-stained blanket lay forgotten on the straw. Outside, the first stars pricked to the indigo veil, sharp as nails. The cold deepened, biting and absolute. Caleb closed his fingers around the knife sheath, the beads rough against his palm. The frontier hadn't softened. Danger still prowled the edges of the known world. But for this moment, under the watchful stars, compassion had woven a thread, thin as spider silk, across a chasm of fear and blood. It wouldn't mend the world, but it held. For now, against a vast, indifferent night, it held.